the fact that I have zero discomfort in just locking myself in a room for weeks on end with a pile of books, and I'll just be a happy camper. At one point, I thought that was a curse, and now I feel like that actually it has been such a blessing in my life. And so it seems like one of the lessons here is that within any of these styles or any of these patterns, or even looking at brain asymmetry, whatever natural predispositions are going on even in our brains, it's kind of leaning into that and asking, where is the hidden superpower in this particular configuration that I have, rather than saying, oh, I wish I could be more like that. I could be more optimistic or less anxious or more anything. It's leaning into this as potential superpowers that are kind of just waiting to be tapped into. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am Cortland Dahl. I'm here with Richie Davidson, one of the most respected and well-known neuroscientists on the planet. And we've been having an amazing series of discussions about Richie's early work going back to the late 70s and proceeding through the 80s and 90s, which was really some of the most pioneering work on the neuroscience of emotions. And specifically, we've been talking about what is known as asymmetry, how the different hemispheres of the brain have some really important and fascinating differences. So we're going to continue that discussion. If you haven't kept up on the previous discussions, that's totally fine, but you can go back and catch up on that. But today we're going to discuss a very interesting nuance, which is about the individual differences we find between when it comes to this topic of asymmetry. To lead into this, Richie, I wanted to share a story because I think it highlights some of the key points we're going to capture today. As you know, we started Tergar, which is Mingyur Rinpoche's meditation community, back in 2009. And for those of you who don't know, Mingyur Rinpoche is a meditation teacher who both Richie and I have studied with. I was kind of new to teaching meditation at that time. I had been teaching a while, but not that much. And I started teaching with a group of other people. There was 3 other instructors. One of them was Myoshin Kelly, who you know well, a really brilliant meditation teacher. And I started teaching with her, and I immediately noticed she is so grounded, so warm, just like the embodiment of care and empathy. And I felt like I was maybe more conceptual. I had been coming from a very academic training, you might say. And I really kind of was judging myself against her and feeling like I needed to be more like Myoshin. And I needed to be somehow, more empathetic and less heady and conceptual. And I was evaluating myself relative to what I saw as her strengths. And that was just kind of going on in my mind for these first few years. And we taught together more and more. And at one point, we had a kind of a heart-to-heart. We were very, very close, almost like family. And at one point, I think she told me that she was kind of doing the same thing. She felt like she appreciated my clarity and some of the precision I brought to the teachings. And I was shocked by that. I was like, why would you want to be more like me? You're like the perfect teacher. And she was shocked that I was thinking that about her. And something really unlocked in that I started to see actually it was so wonderful that we're different. And rather than feeling like I needed to be more like her or she needed to be more like me, I started to see, like I'm bringing something unique to this and it's helpful. I don't need to be everything. And she's obviously bringing something utterly unique and helpful. And it was more the compliment. And it just shifted out of this mindset where I was constantly critiquing myself against some, any range of different idealized versions that I thought I should be. And instead just leaned into the natural skill set I had and the natural, where my mind, and in this case, my teaching ability naturally went. So this is, I thought I immediately remembered that when we were talking about asymmetry and some of what we'll capture today. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you. You can maybe remind us a little bit about some of these key findings with asymmetry, but then specifically we can talk about individual differences and how the default we have, which is usually we're very judgy about ourselves, we can use these findings to have a very different perspective on our own brains, how they function, and even our own minds. So I'll just turn it over to you, and you can maybe kick this off however you like.
Yeah, thank you, Court. It's a beautiful story, and it's particularly warms my heart because I know both of you very well, and I experience each of you as amazing teachers who are very different and totally complementary. Um, so,
And you knew us
uh,
at that time too, so you were probably observing, this
yeah,
whole thing, and
yeah. Yeah, so it's great. So, for those of you who weren't with us when we first started talking about this early work in brain asymmetry, I just want to go back and review a couple of key points. When we began this work, it was started prior to the availability of MRI to probe the human brain non invasively. And pretty much the only way we had to probe the human brain non invasively was with EEG. EEG stands for electroencephalography, and it involves electrodes. They're just little sensors that are literally um, temporarily glued to the scalp surface. Not with super glue, but just with a gel to make contact, and we can pick up electrical signals from the scalp surface that are generated within the brain. And this is a technique that was used at that time. It was really the only technique we had, but it still continues to be used largely because with regard to methods to interrogate human brain function, in general, there's a trade off between the spatial and the temporal resolution of methods. So, methods that tend to have really good spatial resolution have poor temporal resolution, and methods that have very good temporal resolution tend to have poor spatial resolution. So, EEG is a method that has very good temporal resolution but not so good spatial resolution. But that was what we had available at the time. And certainly it was good enough to make inferences about the functioning of different hemispheres of the brain. So we were doing studies where we were recording the brain electrical activity from people and giving them different emotion tasks that elicited emotion, also perceiving emotional faces, for example. And one of the things that we always did with EEG is we recorded a baseline before people started, before we began to present the tasks. And in the early stages of this work, we really used the baseline to make sure that the instruments were calibrated, to make sure that the signals looked like they should look. If there was any fixing of electrodes that needed to occur, we monitored it during this baseline period and we then corrected it and so forth. And we really didn't primarily collect this period for any scientific purpose. It was really for just the strictly methodological purpose of ensuring that the recordings were doing what they were supposed to be doing.
And Richie,
Um,
you mind if I just jump in to give a, or maybe you could just share, like, imagine somebody sitting in the chair, because even like the emotional faces, and could you just take us there? Imagine you're sitting in the room. Like, what would the experience of somebody sitting there be? Like, I remember, all the time it just took to even get, the EEG net on the head, and there was a whole thing around that. And then you'd be sitting there for like the resting state, and then even the emotional faces. It might be interesting for people to hear, like, what would they actually be doing? Like, what is the actual experience like? Before, just so
yeah,
give people a little context for what this
sure,
experience
sure,
actually is.
sure. That's helpful. So we had this net with 256 electrodes, just this giant net. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen pictures. There's an iconic picture that was taken in our lab that was on the cover of National Geographic of a monk wearing this 256 channel EEG net. And, it kind of looks like something from outer space, and each one of these sensors or electrodes has a wire connected to it. So there's 256 wires coming out of this thing. And so it looks like this mass of spaghetti wire that is coming off this net that's on the head. And as you're alluding to, Court, it takes a while to put this on, at
I
least
remember there being all
40.
this like gel that's all over my head, and it's
Yeah, we'd
really
squirt the
funky.
gel with, a blunt syringe. It didn't hurt. It was not piercing the skin, but it was just a way to inject the gel into the electrode and sitting on the scalp surface. Um, and to do that with 256 electrodes takes some time. It was at least 45 minutes of preparation before we were ready to begin recording. The tasks that we used in those days varied, but they included looking at emotional pictures. So in some of the work, particularly work that we were using to probe positive and negative emotion, we would present pictures that were positive pictures, like a parent hugging their child. So there are a whole series of iconic pictures of that sort. And then correspondingly, negative pictures, we often describe them as images of human suffering. A burn victim, for example, where there are clear scars on the face from a burn, or an accident victim. They're the kinds of images that we see in the media all the time. We've gotten a little bit, I think, overexposed and habituated to these images. But nevertheless, in the context of seeing both positive and negative images, they clearly did elicit some emotion, and we were monitoring the changes in the brain that occurred. In some of work we did, we also used video clips, so they weren't just static images, but they also were video clips. So and they included sounds as well in some of the work. So that was the kind of experimental setup that we had. So going back to the setup, we had this period where we were just collecting data during a so-called resting baseline, when people were not exposed to any of these images or video clips. And then we would present the video clips. And after a few years, it really took us a few years of doing this kind of work for reasons that were initially just methodological reasons. We began to look at what's going on during the baseline. And we saw that some people started out at very different places. So if you look at a measure of asymmetry in the prefrontal region of the brain, which is the region where we found these variations associated with emotion, and you took a large group of participants and you computed the asymmetry score, which is essentially the activation difference between the same region in the left prefrontal cortex compared to the corresponding region in the right prefrontal cortex, and expressed it as a difference score or as a ratio, it turned out that there was a bell-shaped curve. That is, it was normally distributed. There were some people that showed extreme right prefrontal activation. There are other people that showed extreme left prefrontal activation, and there was a big hump in the middle. So it was a normally
So
distributed
most of the
shape.
people are in the middle, and then you have small groups that are kind of out on these extremes.
Exactly. And when we first saw that, that's when we decided it was really critical for us to see if this was actually a reliable difference, or whether it was just associated with how much sleep they got that night, what they ate for breakfast, their mood, and just showing transient differences. So we began to do these studies where we brought people back after a week and after a month, and we tested them again, just by just having them sit and rest, not do any task. And sure enough, we found quite remarkably that this was incredibly stable, really more stable than most other physiological signals that people had had studied. And it was a big surprise to us. And so once we established that this was reliable in a statistical sense, so that if you were showing strong left prefrontal activation today and I brought you in a month from now, you would likely be showing strong left prefrontal activation a month from now. That's what this reliability means. And so we then set out to explore, okay, if there are these variations, what are they associated with? Are there differences in kind of personality that are associated with these variations in brain asymmetry? And it turned out that there was indeed a whole constellation of differences that were associated with these variations in brain asymmetry that turned out to be quite interesting. If I can sort of succinctly summarize it, people with stronger left prefrontal activation, we argued, had more of an approach orientation to the world. And by that, we mean these are the kind of people that are ready to jump out of bed in the morning and sort of take on the world. They're very actively engaged. They're more likely to be extroverted and optimistic, and they have this kind of active stance, engaged stance. Whereas others who were more right prefrontal activated were more shy. They may be a little bit more socially anxious. They may be introverted. And it's not that one is better than the other. There are advantages and disadvantages of being extreme on each. And one thing that's important to keep in mind, as you mentioned earlier, Court, most people are in the middle. Most people are not at one extreme or the other. Most people are in the middle. And so this was really an important observation and led us to publish many papers associated with this. And we initially really thought that, just going back to what I was alluding to earlier, that left prefrontal activation was somehow associated with more happiness and more well-being. But it turned out after many years of study that that's just not true.
Hmm.
And so it's more associated with a style of interacting with the world. But, introverted people can be just as happy as extroverted people. And our well being and flourishing probably has more to do with the match between our style and the environment in which we find ourselves, rather than just the characteristics of the brain itself. And that's a critical insight. And so each person, I think, would be benefited from just knowing more about their own style and not necessarily trying to change it so much as simply being aware of it and being able to arrange their circumstances so that it's most conducive to the kind of style that they express.
Yeah, I love this. So, I mean, to me, this feels like the key point in that, and it's against, I think what naturally happens in many of our minds, very similar to what I shared earlier with my, looking at Mioshin and feeling like, oh, why can't I be more like that? It's like we look at somebody else's superpowers and we wish we had them, and then we see, whatever's going on in us as deficits rather than seeing them as potential superpowers. For me, I very much feel like this has been the story of my life, because a lot of the, like very introverted, very much like the shy, like I would have, on this spectrum, probably, I don't know how extreme, but somewhere on towards one side. And now I feel like those things have been such incredible assets in my life. My meditation practice, obviously, I love solitude, and that has served me so well. I mean, I've done, so much retreat, and that's been has brought so much to my life, my creative work and writing and other things, solitude, and that, the fact that I have zero discomfort in just locking myself in a room for weeks on end with a pile of books, and I'll just be a happy camper. At one point, I thought that was a curse, and now I feel like that actually has been such a blessing in my life. And so it seems like one of the lessons here is, is that within any of these styles or any of these patterns, or even looking at brain asymmetry, whatever natural predispositions are going on even in our brains, it's kind of leaning into that and asking, where is the hidden superpower in this particular configuration that I have, rather than saying, oh, I wish I could be more like that. I could be more optimistic or less anxious or more anything. It's more kind of leaning into this as potential superpowers that are kind of just waiting to be tapped into. Seems like that might be one of the key points with this.
Yeah, I think it very much is. And if we go back to our four key pillars of well being: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, um, the dimension of asymmetry is really, to use a technical term, orthogonal, which means independent. It's not directly associated with any one of those pillars. You can be, you can have left-sided activation or right-sided activation and still cultivate all four of these pillars of flourishing, but they will look different.
Mhm.
They won't look the same in a person who has strong left prefrontal activation or a person that has strong right prefrontal activation. But nevertheless, both of those people might be really flourishing.
Hmm. And I'm curious, I have a whole laundry list of questions here. First, might put you on the spot a little bit. Did you measure your own brain? Like, what did you
Yeah,
ever look at? I mean, anybody who knows you, it's not hard to guess where you are in the spectrum. But anyways, I'm
you know,
curious if
I'm,
you did that.
I'm, yeah, I've done it a few times, and I'm, left-sided, but not extreme left-sided.
Yeah.
I'm really, um, I'm in a place in the curve where uh, there are a lot of people,
Yeah.
so not to the far
And
extreme.
you're clearly comfortable with solitude. I mean, you're obviously
Yeah,
very social by nature, but you're also obviously
yeah,
comfortable with
but I'm
solitude. And
actually, yeah, I mean, actually regard myself primarily as an introvert, um,
Mm,
and I mean, compared to my wife, I'm much more introverted than she
yeah.
is, uh, and I'm quite comfortable with that. I mean, I could be extroverted in certain circumstances, but I'm really kind of aware of sort of activating that part of myself in a way that is not my sort of default disposition.
I mean, one interesting thing that maybe we can both talk about this as at a personal level of what's changed over the course of our lives and what hasn't. If I think about my own life, for example, as you know, anybody who listens to Dharma Lab or has, you know, um, heard me talk about my own life, anxiety was a huge theme of my early life back in my 20s. This is back in the 1990s, early 90s when I was in college and starting to meditate. And I would say the thing that has changed dramatically for me is the discomfort in certain situations. Like there were times in life where being in a party, even people who I really liked, even people who I knew well, was not only challenging but actually uncomfortable. Like there was almost, I just had this feeling of like I just immediately wanted to leave. The moment I entered into a situation like that, I just had this impulse of like I just want to be. I would just rather be somewhere else. This is just not fun for me. And then things like public speaking were like actual, complete nightmares for me. So there was this whole gradation of social experience, some of which were mildly unpleasant and some of which were almost unbearable. And I would have done anything to avoid them at that time. And so if I look at what has changed, that discomfort element has almost disappeared. There are very few social situations and even the things that were most uncomfortable, like public speaking. I would say I have almost zero discomfort. In some cases, actually enjoy them. But the thing that has not changed, interestingly, is what I might think of as energizing and depleting. I can be in a room in a party, for example, of people who I love, of people who I thoroughly enjoy being around, but I kind of find it tiring. Whereas I find being on my own energizing and nourishing. Like it's like if you're a video game and you could see the energy meter like going up and down. Like my energy meter kind of goes up when I'm alone. And again, even if it's stuff I love doing with people I enjoy being with, it kind of goes down in social settings. but it's not necessarily uncomfortable. Like I don't dislike it. I certainly don't try to avoid it. But that part hasn't changed at all. I mean, maybe it's less intense because the emotional stuff isn't, I mean, the emotional stuff can be extremely depleting. And then it's like your energy meter, you're like in the death zone, very quickly. So maybe the speed at which it's going down is different. But that's just interesting. Like that hasn't changed at all. But the discomfort has dramatically changed. I'd be curious, what your
Yeah,
experience has been with
yeah,
this.
yeah. I mean, I would say there are two dimensions that have noticeably changed for me. One is also anxiety. I mean, I used to experience a lot of public speaking anxiety as well. And that has, really completely dissipated. I don't experience that anymore. The other is a kind of volatility.
Yeah.
I used to get angry much more than I do now at work. I just really, if someone did something wrong or incompletely or not as well as I thought it should be done. I had very high standards. I mean, I still have high standards, I think. It's just that I recognize that we're all humans and sometimes they're not always going to be met. But I used to have a much stronger reaction to that than I do now. So I would say those two are, I think people around me who've known me for decades would notice, that would comment on those two elements. Now, there are things that haven't changed are my kind of really sort of vibrant commitment to an energy, to an enthusiasm, to and passion to do what I do. And that I would say has really been consistent. But again, the way it is expressed, I think, is a little different now because it doesn't have the same kind of volatility.
That's so helpful. Yeah, I remember when you first told me that you used to fly off the handle and get upset, at times in a workplace setting. That was like inconceivable to me. I mean, I moved here in 2012. We knew each other for a few years before that, but of course started working together very closely then. And I just can't believe that. Like it's hard for me to imagine. It's so night and day from how you are now. It's like almost hard to believe. Of course I believe it, but it just
Well,
shows
one of the
that,
people,
you know,
yeah, one of the people I worked closely with in early days was Cliff Sarin. Some of you may know him. He's one of the neuroscientists who started the Shamatha project with Alan Wallace, and he's done some important meditation research and is a Dharma brother. And I've known Cliff for more than 50 years. So we go back a really long way. We used to scream at each other, just scream at each other in
wasn't he
the
like your lab assistant? I mean, it's amazing. He's like one of the most eminent
yeah, I
researchers in
mean,
the field now, but
a couple of people suggested that we go for marriage counseling, just working together. So, but,
so
fortunately, we're still very close friends and we've been through a lot together. And that was just this crazy style that we evolved. So,
and you both had I imagine you sounds like you were both pretty fiery at that time.
yes, we were both really fiery.
And it's
Yeah.
amazing. Another example of this that we were talking about before we hit record here and started recording this session um, is the far extreme of people who are kind of the exemplars of the meditative traditions. His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We talk about Mingyur Rinpoche all the time. We talk about Khandro Kungabuma, Khandro Tseringma. We were both just in Nepal a month ago with a female teacher who's just like an alien in the best possible way. I mean, just a remarkable individual. And one of the things that's so fascinating about these people who have taken their meditative training to kind of depths that we just can't even imagine is they're completely different. It's not as though the training flattens things out in you. They all are just peaceful, kind of flat emotionally. They're dramatically different from one another. And what captures this to me or summarizes this is when Mingyur Rinpoche came out of retreat, a number of years ago, he did a 5-year retreat where he suddenly, in the middle of the night, he just wandered out of his monastery in rural India, didn't tell I mean, I think a lot of people knew he was going to do this at some point, but he didn't tell anybody when he was going to do it. He literally jumped over the wall and left in the middle of the night, and even his closest attendants he didn't tell. And then disappeared for like 5 years. Nobody knew where he was. And when he came back, everybody was asking, like, what's he like now? Is he different? Like, how is he? And our friend Paul McGowan, who's a documentary filmmaker, just summed it up perfectly. He said, he's exactly the same, only more so. And I thought that was just like the perfect distillation, because it was true. Like, you couldn't say he's not different, but somehow he's different in the exact same way. Like, it's like amplified, what makes him him somehow in a beautiful way. So maybe we could talk about that too, because these are just examples of it, almost like the idea of like tapping into your superpowers versus like you're gonna, we all self-correct to some idealized version.
Yeah, this kind of little exercise that you just laid out, Court, I mean, you and I have talked about this offline periodically, and for me, it's really a kind of really important teaching to just appreciate that these people who, as you say, each of them, I think, are exemplars of the further reaches of human flourishing, and they've all put in enormous amounts of practice and led remarkable lives. And yet each of them is really different. And they have really distinctive kind of personalities, if you will. And so the idea that if you meditate, you know, long enough, your emotions will somehow subside or something like that. It's just not true. Each of these people has meditated an enormous amount in their life, way more than even you have, and you've meditated an enormous amount, Court. And yet they are uniquely different, and there are these. Not sure how best to refer to it, but uh, they're aspects of their personality, their kind of uh, marks of their demeanor that are similar, so that you can recognize them even after, like with Mingyur Rinpoche, after a 5-year retreat, they are still there, except more so. That to me is really interesting. And at least to some extent, these asymmetries that we talked about at the beginning are kind of like that. They do move around some, and they may particularly move around with someone who's depressed and who uh, does certain things to improve their depression. But at these more advanced levels, they don't seem to move around very much. And they may be reflecting in part these qualities that are relatively enduring, that are these, aspects of demeanor that just are different among different people. And there's a reason why people are different and have different kinds of superpowers, because we need those differences to be maximally helpful. And so different teachers have different styles, and they can appeal to different kinds of people. And in other areas of life, those same differences would be adaptive as well.
Do you know, just another bit of a tangent, but an interesting one? Around the time you were doing this work, a lot of really amazing work on heritability, like the twin studies. In fact, at the University of Minnesota, where I did my undergrad, one of my first classes was with Tom Bouchard, and some of the really interesting work was done there. And I got a bit of a front row seat to that. Was there ever any work that you or others did on the heritability of these individual differences when it comes to asymmetry? Like, do we know how
Yeah.
much of it's due to our genetic predispositions?
Yeah, there's been some work, and we did some twin studies of this. And asymmetry with twins is actually a bit complicated, and that would take us in a whole tangent to really deeply explore that, because there is a phenomenon in certain groups of twins that is mirroring, where um, co-twins have opposite patterns of
Oh,
asymmetry.
really?
And actually, it's been even expressed in systemic anatomy, where organs are on different sides of the body in co-twins. And it really has to do with how cell division works and basic issues in embryogenesis.
And this
And
is even with identical twins with mono?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, even with identical twins. So
Okay.
it's
Fascinating. Oh, that's
it
cool.
yeah, there's a lot of complexity and you have to account for that complexity. But putting all that aside, there is evidence for heritability, but this could be a whole subject of another Dharma Lab. We should pin this. Just because something is heritable doesn't really say very much about its modifiability. Um,
And usually things are
and
not, even if they're heritable, it's 40 to 60%. I mean, there's not many things that are like entirely, it's
Exactly. Exactly. And typically, behavioral characteristics or things that are related to behavioral characteristics like this are contributed by literally many, many genes, even hundreds of genes. And so it's not like a simple single genetic um, contribution like with a disorder like Huntington's disorder, which is due primarily to a single gene. So, because of that, it's also more complicated. But there is one of the things we did want to mention in all of this is handedness.
Hmm.
And so I did mention in the previous Dharma Lab recording that all the work we're talking about is work that's been done in right handed people. Right handed people account for roughly 85 percentage ish of the population. And among left handed people are more variable than right handed people. And so among right handed people, virtually all of them, 99 point something percent of right handed people, speak with their left hemispheres. Among left handed people, it's not the case that the right hemisphere is always the hemisphere associated with language. It's much more variable, and there's more bilateral representation of function among left-handed people. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things that are associated with them. And it may be that there's certain groups of left-handed people for whom tasks that require integration between the two hemispheres are actually better
Hmm.
if they have more bilateral representation. And so,
So some
um,
some left-handed people have an increased ability around what, like synthesis or things that are kind of cross hemispheric?
Yeah, so just to give you an example, I looked at this a while ago. I'm not sure it's still true, but at one point it was true that if you look at the membership of the American Architectural Association, there's a much higher percentage of left-handed people who are
Oh.
architects than in the general population.
Hmm, hmm.
Uh, so that's an example of the kind of occupation that may be benefited from the kind of cognitive style that is more prevalent among left-handed people.
Are there other professions or similar things that you see a left hand versus right hand kind of overrepresentation?
I don't know the recent findings on this. We can do another episode of Dharma Lab after I do a little bit of um, poking around the most recent research. There might be. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So maybe we could. So as usual, we every time we have one discussion, we somehow create five more discussions that we need to have. But in any case, maybe we can round this one off. Just going back to maybe the key point for how this insight can help us at a personal level, which really seems to be around identifying and leaning in to the kind of the natural predispositions we have rather than viewing them as weaknesses, finding kind of the buried superpower within things that we might otherwise even think as a problem or a deficit. I know that's certainly been true in my life. But any kind of final thoughts along those lines, or even things or practices, things that have helped you along those lines, Richie?
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about earlier is things that changed in our lives and things that may not have changed that have been consistent. And one of the big things for me is the presence of meta awareness. That is just knowing what's going on in my mind. And I would say my earlier years were characterized by a term that we invented, Cord and I invented and we wrote about in an earlier paper that we call experiential fusion, where, I was just totally fused with the emotions that I was experiencing and really didn't have this kind of background awareness that was a container for it all and gave some opportunity for just looking at it with curiosity. And that itself is a highly stabilizing and regulatory capacity that all of us have. And so that I think is something really important. So whatever our style is, there's a lot of reason to respect different styles. We need people with different kinds of skill sets, different superpowers. And if we can cultivate meta awareness so that we're aware of these differences rather than just being sort of in the river, being carried away, that I think is really helpful.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because if the question is how do we tap into these latent superpowers, and I think back in my own life, I would 100% say that that was certainly the starting point, and in many ways one of the key ingredients, especially in my early years of practice, was exactly that. It was just being more aware of what was going on within me when all this stuff was going on, my mental and emotional habits, my thoughts, the emotions, how that played out in my life and relationships, and just leaning into that and exploring that. And meta awareness is the vehicle for doing, like, you can't do that without meta awareness. That
Exactly.
was just profoundly transformative. So maybe as one of the most kind of fundamental skills, we talk about, flourishing being a skill and well-being being a skill. And in many ways, meta awareness is maybe the critical linchpin for the whole thing. I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
Such a beautiful thing. Well, hopefully, if you're still with us, you found this dialogue enjoyable. So please tune in again. We will certainly continue this discussion, pick up some more of these threads. But thank you, Richie. As always, it's a joy. And for everybody who joined us, thank you for tuning in.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Court.